for Aviation 410. My name is Brett Kane, and today I'm going to be talking to you about every pilot's favorite instrument approach, the straight-in approach. Now, before we get started, I do have a confession. I'm actually filming this at the Liberty Natatorium where I work because my roommate took my whiteboard with him home. So yeah, I apologize if the recording is not up to standards or if there's an echo from this room, and I'm apologizing if you can't see the board, but we're going to do the best with what we got. So let's go ahead and get into this. We're going to start by looking at the outline today. We're going to go over the resources, some of the basics of the straight-in approach, a VDP, VDA, errors, ACS standards, and then we're going to recap. Now you'll notice that I didn't say common errors, but I'll get to that when I get there. So now we've talked about the outline, let's go ahead and jump right into this. This is kind of a shorter lesson, but you'll find that when you get to instrument flight training, a lot of your lessons won't be long, but the information that goes into the lesson require a lot of knowledge. When you get your private pilot, a lot of it is hands-on. You have to memorize some rules and you have to know how to do things, but you spend a lot of time in the airplane actually flying and knowing what to do, getting the muscle memory, getting used to being in the cockpit. While you do have a lot of flight training with instrument, a lot more of instruments work is all up here. There's a lot of rules, a lot of regulations, and a lot of other kind of things that you have to memorize and you have to know before you actually get in the airplane and fly. In fact, the flying portion of instrument training is really easy. You just put the autopilot on, or you just follow the instruments in the cockpit and look at your HUD and everything and just go with it. Now there are some precise movements you have to make towards landing, but for the general overview of instrument training, it's all head knowledge, and that's where you really have to spend the most time. So you have a lot of reading and a lot of assignments you have to do, and that's why we're going to jump into some of the resources. For this specific straight-in approaches, you're going to want to look at the Instrument Procedures Handbook, specifically pages 4-9 through 4-11. This talks about straight-in approaches. It's a lot of good information. You also want to be very familiar with the FAR Regulation 91.175, the takeoff and landing under IFR regulations, which we'll get into and we'll talk about here. You'll also want to be familiar with AIM Section 4, arrival procedures. You want to look under 5-4-5, and that's going to give you some information that we're going to go over here. And then bold method. I really like bold method because if you're a visual learner like me, they have tons of great illustrations and great pictures, which I've put in my notes if you're looking at them as we go, but you can also go to bold method and just look up some of their topics and discussions. Great information. So now we've gone over some of the resources that you need to be familiar with. You need to start reading ahead on and learning. Let's jump into the basics. So a straight-in approach is exactly what it sounds like. It's just flying straight into the runway, all the way down, and doing a semi-straight approach. You're not going to do much turns or much craziness, much procedure turns. You're just going straight in. This can be either designed, there can be exact approaches that are straight-ins for runways, and they're normally given suffixes of a letter Z, Y if they're the same runway so that you don't get them confused. But more often than not, the way you're going to get a straight-in approach to a runway is by vectors. This happens here at Lynchburg all the time. You'll get vectors in and ATC will adjust your course, bring you into line up straight up for the runway, and you'll go in. You won't have to do procedure turns. I made a crude drawing here, but we'll go over it a little bit just so you can kind of visualize what I'm talking about. So for instance, say this here is our runway that we're coming in for, and again, I know it's a crude drawing, but if we're coming in anywhere from this top half of the portion, we're probably just going to get a straight in. We're just going to line up straight with the final approach fix and come right into our missed approach point. However, if we're coming anywhere from the bottom, let's say that this is the north and this is the south, if we're coming in anywhere from the south on this, we're going to have to fly up and do some sort of procedure turn here in this hold pattern in order to turn ourselves back around to the runway. You should be able to see now what a straight-in approach is kind of like. A straight-in approach is coming anywhere from this top portion, again, just on this illustration, and coming straight in for the runway. Again, it's kind of one of those like no-brainers, like duh, why do we even need to go over this? But just so you know, a straight-in approach is coming straight in on a procedure and coming straight into the runway. No procedure turns. Now, I made an important note here that the FAR Regulation 91.175 still applies. Now, if you know your training and you were in Professor Reichert's classes, you've had this hammered into your head. But in case you don't, this is what it's telling you when can you descend below the MDA. And it's for three requirements that you can descend below the MDA. The first one is that the aircraft is in a continuous position for a descent to landing on the intended runway that can be made at a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvers. So you're not doing anything crazy, you're not coming in like Maverick on Top Gun trying to drop in, you're coming in normal, just doing a straight in approach. That's the first reason you can descend below the MDA. The second is that the flight visibility is not less than the visibility prescribed in the standard instrument approach being used. So you're not lower than your minimums on your plate. And then the third reason is a list of items. I'm not going to read them all to you, but basically you can see the threshold markings. If you can see any of those, you can continue down to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. Again, this is information you need to read and you need to know because it plays into the straight-in approach. The straight-in approach is not hard. The learning the information is the part that you really need to study, and there's no way to do it other than actually opening the book and cracking down on it. So, we've talked about the basics of straight-in approach. We've talked about how really it's a no-brainer. You just go straight in for the runway. Let's get into some specifics with the straight-in approach, the VDP and the VDA. We're going to start with the VDP. And again, there's illustrations in my lesson plan if you're watching this as we go along. But the VDP stands for your visual descent point. And I've made a crude drawing over here. The visual descent point is this black V. That's it. That's all it is. On your instrument approach, your plan view, it's going to be the black V. So what is a visual descent point? Essentially, a visual descent point is defined as the final approach course of a non-precision straight-in approach procedure from which a stabilized visual descent from the MDA to the runway touchdown point may be commenced. Now, none of us are lawyers, we're all pilots, so what's that mean in plain English? Essentially, the vertical descent point is where you can make a normal landing looking outside like you normally would on a non-instrument day. But the importance of this is to know that your object clearance is not assured. When you're flying an instrument procedure, if you follow it exactly and you're not going below your altitude, you are cleared of all obstacles by definition of the instrument approach. When you reach your visual descent point and you decide to switch from following your instruments down and going to visual, you're not assured of anything. You're then having to clear your area as the pilot. So that's the big difference with what a VDP is. When you first hear VDP, you think it's something confusing, you think it's something difficult, and then when you hear the explanation, you're like, well, that's pretty much what I do as a private pilot anyways. I make a normal descent to the runway just using my eyes. And that's exactly what it is. Don't overthink it. It's very easy. It's just a normal descent to the runway looking at it using your eyesight. But the caveat is that this is part of an instrument approach, so when you start your VDP, you're not assured of your clearances anymore. You're not assured of not hitting obstacles. So you can only transition over to your VDP if you have visual references. If you don't have any visual references, you need to stick to your instrument approach because you're cleared of all obstacles following that approach. So obviously, as we said, you're not clear of obstacles, you're not assured of any of that if you're on a VDP, so make sure you do not descend below the MDA while you're on your visual descent because you don't want to hit anything below you. It's just, standard. The MDA is the highest point where you won't hit any obstacles before going miss, so you want to make sure that you don't descend below that. Again, it's really hard to talk about this because it's such a simple concept, but just so you know what a VDP is. I've never flown a VDP. I might have once on my instrument approaches just so just because my instructor wanted me to get his hand twisting up on my words. Just because my instructor wanted me to get a feel for it. But if you're flying an instrument approach and it's bad weather, you don't really want to be trying to go visual. But that's what a VDP is. The VDA is your vertical descent angle. Now, if there's a VDP published, there's 90% of the time there's also going to be the angle on the publication chart of what you're coming down as. And you want to think of your VDA as your visual glide slope indicator, which is like your PAPIs or your VASIs or things like that. Think of this as your lights, except in instrument conditions you can't see the lights, so you're going to set your pitch down for an angle rather than for the lights. But essentially they're the same process, they do the same thing. Remember, your VDA is only going to be a guide. You're setting down for about 3 degrees or whatever your angle is for that approach. That's only a guide. It's going to give you a smooth flight down instead of all the step downs like you would normally do. It does not clear you of your obstacles. It does not make sure that you don't run into things. It does not make sure you don't descend below your VDA, your minimum descent altitude, your MDA. It's just to make it easier on your passengers. I know I have never flown a VDA. It's just something that I've never flown. If I'm flying an instrument approach, I'm not worried about my angle so much as looking at my charts, looking at my screen, and making sure that everything looks good. I'm just following the instrument approach. But if there was a reason that you wanted to just look at your angle, say you're coming in on a VDP, you have a published VDP, but you don't have a VDA, you're coming in, you want to make sure you're going to land smooth, you got a bunch of passengers in the back, you want to get a really good tip after landing, so you don't want to make things bumpy. Your procedure calls for a bunch of step downs because it's a non-precision approach. A VDA might be a good option. That's a good real world scenario that you want to use a VDA because that's going to turn all those step downs into a nice smooth descent based upon the angle. Again though, it gets really iffy if you have bad weather. VDA and VDP are two things you want to use if you have good weather. If you get down to about 1,000 feet and you break out of the clouds immediately, then you can start looking at these things. Otherwise, you probably just want to follow your approach. Now, a VDA is an angle. That means there's math. If a VDA is not listed on the approach, you can figure one out for yourself by the 1 and 60 rule. We're just going to touch on this briefly because it's something you need to know about and be familiar with, but you're probably not going to use very often. So, the 1 in 60 rule states that, and I'll read the definition to you. The rule states that 1 degree of climb or descent equals 100 nautical miles. You might have heard of this rule before talking about DMEs, but essentially it equals one degree of climb or descent, angle of the nose, equals 100 nautical miles. So say, we'll work through a problem real quick here. Say we have a procedure where we're going from 7,100 feet to 6,700 feet in 4 nautical miles. 7,100 minus 6,700 equals 400 feet. So we need to descend 400 feet in 1 nautical mile. So now, how's the math for that? Well, this is an easy problem, so it equals 100 feet per nautical mile to lose the 400 feet in the 4 nautical miles. So again, our rule says that 1 degree nose down equals 100 feet per nautical mile. So in this example, dropping 400 nautical miles, we can see dropping 400 feet in 4 nautical miles, we can see that angling the nose down 1 degree will give us a good VDA to reach our 6,700 feet, our next point, in a smooth glide down. Again, this is what the G1000 does for us when we're flying RNAV. It's what the LNAV is. It does it for us. This is not new concepts, it's just new phrases and new terminology. So, I know I'm getting close to the end of my time, so let's go ahead and just review what we're looking at here. We've gone over the resources, how instrument flying is a lot of head knowledge. You need to know the information in your head because that plays into your flying more than just the stick and rudder skills. We've talked about the basics of a straight-in approach, how you don't overthink it, it's just flying straight into the runway. It can be designed via the approach, or more commonly, you get vectors to a straight-in approach. You still have to follow all regulations for a straight-in approach, including the wind to descend below the MDA, which is FAR 91-175. We've talked about a VDP, which is a visual descent point, which is essentially just using your vision and your eyesight to clear the area around you and descending as a normal descent to the runway instead of following the procedure anymore. And we've talked about a VDA, which plays closely with a VDP as the angle that will give you your great, let's see, what's the word I want to use? The angle that will give you your smoothest step down. There you go. You have a non-precision approach, lots of jagged step downs. Instead of giving that roughness on the stomach and the back to your passengers, a VDA can give you a nice smooth descent down. And we've also talked about the 1 in 60 rule. Again, I know I flew through this information. I know I've been talking fast. It's a lot of stuff to get into 15 minutes. But I hope now that you have a better understanding of what a straight-in approach is. Again, you've probably already been flying this and just didn't realize that it was a specific type of approach. But I hope you have a great day, a great weekend, and stay safe.